Speaking for the trees, no matter where they're from. The podcast.
All right, today's guest on Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is Kevin Emmerich of Basin and Range Watch. Kevin, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself and also about Basin and Range Watch?
Yeah, I'm Kevin. I'm actually a former park ranger and biologist, and ended up buying a place with my partner Laura in the middle of a nature conservancy preserve in the Mojave Desert in Nevada. And the reason I'm bringing that up is we started to get surrounded by proposals for really big solar projects and some mining. But as an organization, we formed primarily to address the impacts and the threats of large-scale renewable energy on the desert. And as you can see from the news, it certainly hasn't gone away. It's grown and it's gotten bigger. But Basin and Range Watch is a nonprofit, and we primarily follow renewable projects. But not only that, we're essentially a watchdog group for environmental issues in the Mojave Desert.
Right, right. And then up into northern Nevada, too, as well, which is kind of outside of the Mojave.
True. I mean, we do cover the Great Basin. And all in all, the Basin and Range is huge, it extends into Arizona. So we don't really have a limited range, except that we try to do what's practical, and we tend to do a lot of the stuff closer to us. But yes, I should say we are following a few of the Great Basin desert issues, which I can talk about.
Sure, sure. And so you have kind of a generalized opposition to industrial development in the desert areas there of the Great Basin and the Mojave. But as it turns out, that isn't really a lot of fossil fuel production in that area, is it?
No, geologically speaking, it's not really the best place for oil reserves due to its broken topography. When you think about where they're getting oil, and they're doing a lot of the oil and gas leasing in the Colorado Plateau, it's a fairly uniform geology. But here in the Basin and Range, everything's been broken up and uplifted and sunk down or extended, and so oil deposits are pretty hard to find and hard to get to. They exist out here, but it's nothing economically viable enough to make a large industry. So extraction here is more mining and renewables related.
Right, right. And the history of the mining in that area goes back a long time.
Oh yeah, I mean that's Nevada's a state based on mining. Yeah, so it goes
Right,
back
right,
for quite a while. And where
right.
we live, just on the northern Amargosa River, there's really a gold rush happening now, and we have 8 companies here doing, or 9 companies doing intense exploration. And now a proposal for 3 big open pits just not far from where we live, right along the Amargosa. So there's a pretty big threat to the water resources around here from a lot of these mining issues.
Right. And those are gold mines or
There are gold mines here, but we also have just north of that a fairly large lithium mining proposal called Bonnie Claire Lithium, and it would be huge. They say, of course, it's the biggest deposit in the world, but what lithium company looking for investors doesn't say that? So, but
yeah,
still,
I've seen those claims other places. Yeah.
yeah. But the gold is a particular concern simply because in order to get what they want, they need to go below the water table in the Amargosa River and its tributaries. And in order to get that gold, they have to pump the water out, called dewatering. And that said, it could lower some of the spring levels here, water levels up to 13 feet. And so that's significant. That'll cause extinction level damage to some of the riparian here.
Right. And so the Amargosa River is not a very long river, right? It starts in Nevada and then does it flow into Death Valley before it peters out?
Yeah, I mean, it pretty much that's the terminus, and then to the lowest point in the northern hemisphere of Death Valley, and it's actually pretty. I mean, it's probably about 130. Don't quote me on that, miles long, but it's a somewhat long river. It's just that a great portion of it is under the ground, and so it's not
Ah,
surface and just only areas where there's been a lot of geologic uplift and faulting, and so. Yeah, it's a beautiful place.
right, right. Yeah, and as you know, I've visited there. I can't remember when it was, 2016, 2017. And I recall one of the highlights of my visit was that I got to meet the Amargosa toad, who lives along, correct me if I'm wrong, only a 9 mile stretch of that river and nowhere else.
Yeah, it's an endemic toad. It's only found in the Oasis Valley, Nevada, and it, of course, is water dependent, so it depends on all of that surface water. And there's been development here that's actually reduced some of the habitat for it, but there have been some recent efforts to create habitat. But if we don't have the water, if it suddenly just disappears and goes into some mining operation, those toads won't have a place. And yeah, so it's a very limited range. It's a species that a lot of people have recognized and tried to help, but it needs water.
Right. Okay, so we've been talking so far specifically about that area that you're in there and some of the issues there around some of the projects, but I wanted to back up just for a moment to a little bit of a bigger picture because I think that as you well know, when most people hear about green energy projects, they consider this to be a positive thing, to be an environmentally positive thing, in fact. But what's really missing from the conversation most of the time are all the various environmental effects of these different kinds of projects. So I was hoping if you could speak to that just a little bit. It's sort of the a big picture, a more general perspective on what kinds of environmental problems are caused by wind, solar, lithium mining, etc.
Well, okay. I mean, I'll start with solar, and I know that some folks they think that we have to do this right now because we need to stop fossil fuel emissions from happening, and I don't disagree with stopping fossil fuel emissions, but I think many of the impacts that I'm about to talk about are getting either overlooked or justified by what they would call like a green energy transition. And
Right.
so, starting with solar energy, it's low density energy, meaning that you need quite a lot of space in order to produce the same output that a fossil fuel plant or you know, even a nuclear plant could actually produce. You would just need a lot of space to do so. And so that means we just have to put those panels just about everywhere. We're a little luckier here in the US than, say, some of those ecosystems. And well, if you've seen photos of China, they've actually covered whole mountains with solar panels. It's almost shocking to see that. But the point being that wherever they put this, it needs a lot of space. And so they also want to have good solar insolation. That's where there's a lot of, radiant solar energy coming down. And so they like the desert. They want relatively flat areas, although some of them do want to build on sloping areas as well that are south facing, and they want to be near transmission infrastructure. And so, you know, the where all of the special areas and ecosystems are located, I mean, they didn't necessarily choose to be next to transmission areas either, but we're dealing with situations where the solar projects need to either scrape up or drive over thousands of acres of habitat. That's how we see it. They see it as open land. We see it more as habitat. Up in the Great Basin, for example, I mean, we want to talk about that area. Um, the basin and range area is characterized by a mountain range, and then 40 to 60 to 80 miles, there's another mountain range, but those basins are flat in the bottom. And once we can get some transmission built out there, at least that's how the companies are looking at it, we can fill a lot of those basins with solar panels. And so we have a lot of proposals in the area for really big transmission lines that are going to connect these solar panels up in the Great Basin. And they're going to have to build it among those sagebrush ecosystems. And there's a lot of applications now. I would say roughly about maybe 75,000 to 85,000 acres of solar applications in the Nevada Great Basin alone. And they're big. Some of them are like we're looking at 10,000 acre, 15,000 acre proposals, and one of them was even like 25,000 acres. And so these guys just try to claim all of the land out there. But what they're going to need to do is they're going to have to remove a lot of that sagebrush. And that, of course, is habitat for sage grouse, pygmy rabbit, and a host of other species that actually use that habitat. And it's a tragedy to think that if they finally do build this power line called Green Lake North from the Reno area to the Robinson substation outside of Ely, that many thousand acres of that habitat could be developed for solar. Solar has a lot of impacts. They need to scrape the ground, and in the Mojave Desert here we have a thin, sometimes thicker surface called desert pavement, which is essentially a flat layer of stones or rocks that's been cleaned out by years and years of wind, erosion, and settlement. And desert pavement is really important for holding soils together, even holds moisture in the ground, and some of the desert plants really benefit off of it. Well, a lot of that will get scraped up, and that area below it that can get run over so many times, it becomes a fine dust, and it just becomes airborne. And some of the dust is caliche. It's carbon-based lime, just broken down limestone. And caliche in a fine enough dust, when it becomes airborne, becomes a greenhouse gas. And so we have that element. Another really big element of these solar projects is that when they build them and they do all of that scraping and that driving and running over of habitat, they need water to mitigate the dust. And so we have a cluster of solar projects down in the Mojave Desert here, south of Pahrump, Nevada. And there's roughly 29,000 to 30,000 acres of either developed projects or proposals that collectively would need about 5,000 acre feet of water in order to construct them. And so they're proposing wells near the solar projects, but those would also be near spring areas or underground or groundwater areas that have groundwater close to the surface that support a lot of mesquite and other phreatophyte plants. And so there's quite a bit of pressure to develop a lot of that. There's also birds. This is a problem with wind turbines as well. We're not following as many wind proposals here in Nevada, but the one project that we do have so far has managed to kill 8 golden eagles since its operation, and a number of other birds and raptors, including saw-whet owls. But the turbines tips will move at approximately 180 miles per hour, and the birds don't see those, and they do create a problem. In solar energy, we have the power towers that were built, those are the big thermal plants that are radiated by mirrors, but they create a solar flux that actually burn birds in midair. Unfortunately, there are no proposals to build any more of those that I know of, just because they're really expensive and pretty inefficient. And they're pretty even recognized as pretty bad for the environment. But birds can also see solar panels as a lake-like entity as they're looking on the ground, and the lake effect is theorized to draw some birds to some of these large sprawling photovoltaic projects. And they do find a lot of birds in some of these projects in Southern California, a lot of birds that have collided with solar panels. So there is a pretty big town of dead birds. The solar industry says there's really not enough evidence to prove all of that. But we talked to some biologists that tell us they find buckets of dead birds from some of these projects. There's also the people factor. A lot of them need to be built next to small communities, and we work with a lot of them, and it is kind of heartbreaking. I mean, we have some projects that want to build, like less than a quarter mile, just a few 100 feet from people's homes, and it just becomes a really big deal, and they get worried about the water too. They get worried about their local habitat, and it surprises me how many people in these little towns come out in defense of the desert ecosystem. You may have heard of the project outside of Boron, California, that they're chainsawing down about 4,200 Joshua trees. That's another huge impact. It's like a removal of the native plant and then an invasion of exotic plants. One of the big solar projects south of Pahrump, Nevada, did a lot of driving and crushing over that habitat. And after the Hurricane Hillary event that we had, that particular project had a giant flux of invasive weeds where they had to actually spray with herbicides in order to control them. So we have a number of impacts I could keep talking about, but I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Right. Well, I mean, that's quite a bit. I mean, I think that people, in general, I think that people don't understand that the desert ecosystems of the Mojave, the Great Basin, the Sonoran, that these are places that are really full of life, and that they are important habitat. You use the phrase open land versus habitat, and how people look at this. And certainly the energy companies just look at it as open land. But unfortunately, it seems like a lot of the general public also does just look at it, the deserts, as being open land, not as habitat, And I think this is in part because those kinds of areas aren't good for agriculture. And we're a very agriculturally focused society. I mean, even people who live in cities, we are entirely dependent on agriculture. So that's kind of one way that we look at land as being valuable, or we'll look at it as being valuable because there's some kind of spectacle, like, oh, there's a lush forest or et cetera. And so the beauty of the desert is more subtle, and it's also perhaps, and it's also just more unfamiliar, to people. And so they do consider it to be a place that is okay to just sacrifice because they're not even seeing it as being a sacrifice.
One thing I will say is that large-scale solar energy is getting more and more unpopular. And it's made a lot of news recently all over the West. You might have heard of the Western Solar Plan.
I had that in my notes to bring that up next. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Was this a good time for the Western?
Yeah, go for it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So to me, this is an interesting one because it really started to get people interested in this issue like never before. At least I hadn't seen it. This plan was essentially a revision of a plan that the Obama administration approved in 2012. And it was really a plan to make solar a smart. Let me start over. It was really a smart planning type of architectural plan for solar energy on public lands in the West. And so they created these different categories for solar energy and the land that would host the solar energy. Well, first of all, there were solar energy zones, and those would be areas where they would direct all the development. Then there would be solar exclusion areas where they didn't allow the solar. There'd be avoidance areas where they would allow some solar with a little bit of modification. And they opened up about 6 western states, about a little over 300,000 acres to these solar energy zones, and it failed miserably. None of the solar companies liked it because they couldn't really get around a lot of the mitigation costs and the lease fees. And so they had a third category in that plan that they approved called variant plans. And they opened 22 million acres up to solar development, business as usual. Only they would review it with a variance process, which is just kind of really a bullshit review that didn't really make much of a difference. It was supposed to be that people could get involved and before they went into an actual national environmental policy act review and say, hey, we don't want this out there. But it turned out that the solar companies dominated the scene. And every variance review winds up in a eventual approval of a full-fledged review for a solar project. And that's all it was. And so in 2024, they revised this plan. And they came up with 5 alternatives. And the alternative 5 would have been the most reasonable one for an environmentalist because it really concentrated the energy on some of the more disturbed lands and closer to the highways and the transmission line. And it freed up the least amount of land. But the solar industry and a couple environmental organizations really fought that. And they asked for things like, well, we don't want all occupied habitat for endangered species excluded from this plan. And that was one of the better things about Alternative 5. But unfortunately, the industries dominated it. And the Biden administration is very pro-solar on public lands. And so they're going to put the industry's priorities over the environmental conservation priorities. And so in a lot of the states, they opened up close to 31 million acres. They added 5 extra western states. They opened up 31 million acres to solar energy development. And not all of that would be developed, but that's how much land these companies would be allowed to, put their applications in for. In Nevada, it was really large. And they ended up opening, I think it was 22 million, something like that. Or no, I have to be quoted on that. I'm not really sure how much land was opened up in Nevada, but there were some really big swath areas, like in the Amargosa Valley, up in Esmeralda County, just west of Tonopah. A lot in the Great Basin was actually opened up for solar development. And it just pissed a lot of the local counties off. It pissed off a lot of the environmental groups. And it shocked a lot of the people in the news media. In fact, I saw some of the local news channels talk about this, and they painted it in a really negative light. And I've never seen solar energy so unpopular because of the way it was done and the way it was kind of forced upon little communities. There weren't any real good community setbacks. They didn't really listen to a lot of people for excluding different areas. So we have environmental groups, we have off-road groups, we'd have mining groups. Everybody was really mad at this plan. And I don't know how that's going to translate to the new administration, but to me, it was kind of a tipping point in the popularity of solar. And it became a situation where just about every solar project proposed here in Nevada had far more opposition and almost zero support just from the public. And so that's what I'll say about that, that they brought it into the spotlight, and it became so unpopular to a lot of people that solar energy, I don't think right now locally or even statewide is looked at as a positive thing. And we hadn't seen that before, but it seems to be evolving into that. One other thing about that too is that the solar plan isn't passed. It had a final environmental impact statement, and just about every environmental organization, except a few of the more questionable ones, protested the final. You can do that, and we did it as well. And so, but if it doesn't pass, the unfortunate thing about this is that all of the solar companies have already staked their claims on the public land they want. And all of those applications are grandfathered into the plan. And so even if we got the most conservation oriented alternative for the Western Solar Plan, all of these big projects that we're following right now don't even count. And so to me, it's more of a show, the plan. It's more of a sort of a decoy to get people's minds off what's really happening. But it backfired on this particular administration with a really big media backlash.
That's very interesting. I hadn't heard about that yet. And of course, local media is going to be sending different messages than national media because they're paying attention to what people in their own areas are saying. We wanted to emphasize a point here that we haven't said explicitly, but probably it's been obvious so far. But just that when we're talking about these large projects, public land is always where this is happening. Like this isn't. These huge projects aren't. It's not like a solar company goes out and buys, 20,000 acres somewhere to do this project. This is public land, where these kinds of projects are happening, and because it's on public land, it's subject to NEPA, which is looking at environmental impacts. And so there's a process that needs to be followed there. So could you talk just a little bit about NEPA, what that stands for, what it's about, and how has NEPA been affected by these different efforts by the industry to develop out there?
Well, NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act. It was, I think, signed into law in, mid 70s. I'm going to say. I always thought it was 1976, but it could have been earlier than that. But it really is a law that allows theoretically everyone to get involved, and it requires a pretty vigorous review on a lot of these plans, and so a lot of us use the National Environmental Policy Act in our comments, in the groups that actually litigate use it heavily. So the National Environmental Policy Act is essential, really, into actually getting your opinion, heard on one of these projects. But the problem is does it really work? And you ask, well, how did the project how has that been impacted? I mean, it's complicated. I mean, in the 2018s or so, back in that day when we had the Donald Trump presidency, he really attacked the National Environmental Policy Act, or his administration did, and they really attempted to weaken it. And what was ironic about it, that got praised from the renewables industry. The American Wind Energy Association said it was really a smart thing to do, and they thanked him for that. We have the Biden administration that restored a lot of those, setbacks that were attempted, which was good, but at the same time, they're just allowing everything to go through. In my opinion, they're undermining the laws by just always approving these projects and always finding a way to either mitigate it or justify it as some part of the greater good. And we're following probably, I would say, 7 of these projects in NEPA right now. And it's really difficult, and it's frustrating because we know that a lot of what we're going to be writing there is not going to be listened to. We do it because we get it on the record, we get standing, and if somebody decides to use litigation on one of these projects, they have a lot of what we said on the record to use. And so it's useful in that regard. But the NEPA process, in my view, has been compromised by this industry and a lot of industries, really. I mean, it's not just the solar and wind and geothermal industry that's doing it. It's just it's easily whittled away by the attorney for a lot of these companies, and unfortunately, it hasn't really worked to be engaged in this process to try to influence the agencies. I think they're really afraid of getting sued by a lot of these big companies, and they have the big attorneys, and they end up always kind of siding with them and allowing them, to build where they are. If there's a big, giant public outcry about some project, sometimes you can be successful, but for the most part, NEPA is just a tool that we use to, potentially get involved in a litigation on a project at this point.
Right. And have there been any instances where NEPA has been watered down specifically for green energy projects?
I'd have to say, yeah, definitely. When they use a lot of the guidelines for the BLM, they've tried to get around them a lot. Like they have to fully evaluate how a project will be affected visually, and sometimes they'll, not require the proper surveys at the proper time for the different biological resources, and so we'll get some pretty weak reports in that regard. I'm trying to think of some examples off the top of my head where they have, and one of them is that there's that one of the projects in Pahrump Valley relied on some pretty outdated desert tortoise surveys to approve, permitting this project, and they grossly undercounted the desert tortoises. The surveys were conducted in like 1990 or 1991 on a pretty dry year. And so they underestimated the density of the population. And then when they developed the project, they ended up getting about 3 times as many as they predicted. And it turned out to be a pretty big disaster. And had NEPA fully evaluated something like that, it could have ended up differently. Maybe that would have could have resulted in avoiding the area. You never know. No?
Right. Okay. Yeah. And you mentioned the desert tortoise. So I think maybe just let's give the desert tortoise a minute or two here, because I think it's such an amazing species. Hasn't the desert tortoise been around for several million years, maybe as long as 15 million years, since the area was much wetter, even jungle-like?
Yeah, I I don't really have that number memorized, but yes, the desert tortoise has a very long history um, in that particular area, probably as like kind of a bigger, more gigantic animal at the time. But at the point now, it's sad because its numbers have crashed in the last maybe 2 decades by almost 40%, maybe 50% in a lot of areas. And a lot of those mostly hit hard areas are located in the western part of its range, the West Mojave Desert, which, as you know, is closest to some of the bigger urban areas. And so there's a lot of land use going out there, whether it's urban sprawl or heavy vehicle use or livestock grazing, or you know, raven population increase associated with urbanization. But for the most part, the tortoise is not doing too well. And there are a few places where the tortoise is actually doing very well. And one of those is the Pahrump Valley. That's another solar zone. That's where they're developing a lot. And the Pahrump Valley tortoise densities, if we talked about these densities like 13 per square kilometer, 6 per square kilometer. 30 to 40 years ago, that would be considered low. 30 to 40 years ago, desert tortoise densities in some of the big population areas were like 150 or so per square kilometer. But we're down to areas like the Pahrump Valley now, but those are viable breeding populations. So it really doesn't make sense to start grabbing them and moving them out of something like 29,000 acres of habitat. I mean, they're not going to put these tortoises back on the solar project. They're going to move them south to an area called Tacopa Road. And Tacopa Road is the area that's called the Stump Spring Translocation area. So that's sort of a dumping ground for tortoises when you move them out of the way for construction. And so we're effectively adding to a population decline of desert tortoises by allowing these solar projects to be built there. I wanted to also say, when you talked about the NEPA violation, we have actually tried to get the Bureau of Land Management to consider an alternative to this projects in the Pahrump Valley and another area called the Indian Springs and Mercury Valley, to consider an area of critical environmental concern alternatives. And what we did is we wrote up a couple proposals in these two areas for the BLM to actually protect the entire area. And we used the desert tortoise as one of our main elements of this ACEC proposal because of its decline and because of the population stability in the areas we're talking about. But we also used other environmental elements like mesquite areas, neotropical migrants, archaeological areas like the Salt Song Trail, which is a sacred trail for the Paiute, the historic Old Spanish National Historic Trail, paleontological resources and fossils. And we asked them to consider these as alternatives to these solar projects in their NEPA review, and they refused every time. And they said that doesn't fit the scope of what the project is about. And we feel under NEPA, this is a violation because under that act, the BLM is required to consider reasonable alternatives in an environmental situation, protecting the environment, that's considered reasonable under the National Environmental Policy Act. So in that regard, we believe the BLM has violated NEPA. And I think that's probably one of the best examples I can give you on that. I just had to think about it.
Right. Yeah. So, I as you'll recall, I sent you an email requesting to talk to you about the incoming administration before the election, because I knew that no matter what the outcome of the election was, it was going to have an effect on these kinds of projects. And um, from the perspective of being opposed to habitat destruction and all the other environmental problems that are happening in the Mojave and the Great Basin from green energy. From that perspective, what do you think that the Trump administration is going to bring?
So this is a real interesting question. We're just speculating here. Um, it could go different ways. I'll just put out some of this alternative that I think, could actually happen here. He has in his debate and public speeches singled out solar energy. He doesn't necessarily get things right. He said rabbits get caught in the fences of solar projects, and he was really referring to wildlife. I mean, it does happen sometimes. Snakes and road runners have actually been caught in fences surrounding solar projects. So he heard that. And another in the debate, he said, "You need the whole desert." He said these are really environmentally bad, and it was interesting to hear him say that. We've heard his team say that they're going to go drill, baby, drill, and they're going to sign a lot of orders that get rid of the Inflation Reduction Act and take away a lot of the incentives for solar energy. And so it'll be interesting to see what happened. In 2017, his administration put a moratorium on the BLM accepting any new solar applications for an entire year. And so the question is, will he do that again? We're not really sure about that, because one of the reasons that I'm not too sure about all of this, and one of the reasons it confuses me, is he's got Elon Musk advising him, and Elon's very, big on lithium mining. I mean, that was really his industry right there. And I've never really seen Elon Musk say too many negative things about solar energy. I've seen him say that we should cover a corner of Nevada with solar panels to power the country. And so that indicates to me that he's kind of behind a lot of those things. And so, what's Trump going to do? I'm not 100% sure. We do know he's going to probably cut the National Environmental Policy Act again. He's going to remove a lot of the regulatory hurdles, and many of those, of course, will be environmental. And when he does that, that's going to benefit a lot of industry. And like I said, the Wind Energy Association came out in support of what he did. What I'm thinking is some of the bigger companies that want to build solar projects might survive Donald Trump simply because they're big lobbyists, like NextEra Energy. They built the Yellow Pine project. They have some really big other proposals. There's EDF Renewables. They're the largest utility in France, and they build nuclear plants mostly, but they have a U.S. solar company over here, and they've got a lot of proposals as well. They're really well funded, and a lot of them can build these projects without a lot of the incentives and the goodies. One thing I wonder, though, is will Trump put more tariffs on solar panels? Because we do know it's still cheapest to import these from China. The Biden administration put the tariffs on there because of the way the workers were being treated. We don't think Trump would really care too much about that, but he's kind of a buy American person, and that might be a way he would foil the solar industry, and that would hurt them economically. And so, but my question is how much would Elon Musk influence him into permitting more renewable energy? One interesting thing about the Trump administration is they came up with the executive order to expedite the development of critical minerals. I mean, the term critical minerals came up under Trump, and so that includes lithium, a lot of different things, copper. There's a lot of critical minerals out there. And The Biden administration never rolled that back. They just held on to it. They turned critical mineral mining into a justifiable renewable energy industry. And let's face it, renewable energy does need those minerals. And so Trump's certainly not going to roll back critical minerals. I mean, he's going to fight any reforms to the mining laws of 1872. So green energy mining will probably survive, maybe under the guise of something else. But those are just some speculations of it. The outgoing Biden administration is putting on a big rush to approve some of these projects before the new administration takes over in January. So we have both these competing administrations, working on their plans for public lands, and I'm hoping that we do get some rollbacks on solar projects from the Trump administration. I'm not happy at all that we're going to get 4 more years of these people, but I'm hoping there are at least some benefit that occur from it. But time will tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we can all agree that overall, environmentally, the Trump administration is likely to be just terrible, horrific across the board. But that there is within that context, there is a possible silver lining that, yes, maybe some of these large solar projects would get canceled or put off for now. And even if they're just put off, that's a few more years that the creatures who call that land habitat get to be there, and that's that much longer to see if we can save it permanently. Yeah, the lithium mining, we didn't talk much about that, but that's another thing that y'all are keeping your eye on, and that's been developed a lot in Nevada and then up into Oregon as well. And the lithium, of course, is needed for the batteries for the electric cars, And
Yeah.
I saw a clip from a speech that Trump had given shortly before the election, and he was speaking, I think, in front of some auto workers, and he was delivering, a line that he delivered many times before about he's against electric vehicles. This is always something he's said to American auto workers, because I think the idea is that he wants to keep electric vehicles out from other countries, et cetera. Anyway, this has been a theme of his now for years, of just opposing electric vehicles. But then he stopped halfway through the point he was making. He says, well, actually, I've been spending more, I'm paraphrasing him here, of course. I've been spending more time with Elon Musk lately, and he's been talking to me about this. And so actually, I do think there's a place for them, he said, and I just really laughed, because that was definitely a theme this year of his campaign, was that he would get a big donation from some billionaire or spend some time with some billionaire, and then he would just completely flip-flop on something that he'd said before, and here it was. And so I saw that, and I took that seriously. I'm like, okay, well, so in terms of lithium mining and whatever else needs to go with it, critical minerals for the electric vehicles, probably he'll just want to make that easier because of his friend Elon.
Well, and also just the mining industry in general has embraced these critical minerals, and of course lithium mining, and they're a big lobby of the Trump administration. In all honesty, I don't see that getting better.
Yeah.
And if you'll remember that the Thacker Pass mine was approved at the end of the Trump administration on public land. And
Right.
so, and they did their part in streamlining that review as well. And I was part of that lawsuit, so I saw them. It was really frustrating to watch it. But unfortunately, the next administration didn't do much to change what they did. So I think lithium's here to stay because of Elon and because the electric vehicle industry is not going to just go away. Lithium is also needed for large scale solar batteries, and they actually do use quite a lot of it. And this is a side note, a lot of the solar plans, they don't even talk about what might happen if some of those start to burn. And that could happen out there. And that's a pretty big impact that I didn't talk about earlier. But back to Trump, I do agree with you. I think that the electric vehicle industry has gotten too big really to just go away. And I just don't think he's just going to be able to crush it like that. But again, we'll see what happens. Maybe I'm underestimating him. I mean, what I hear is scary. I mean, mass deportations is like a overhaul. I mean, he's going to get rid of all these federal agencies, and I'm hearing some pretty strong stuff from the source. And so I'm not walking into this, all happy and thinking Trump's going to help us. A lot of the people in these little towns around here voted for him for that reason. And I hope he does come through. But the problem also here in Nevada is developing renewable energy is in the state constitution. Reaching the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, with put in part of the Constitution. And the renewable companies are heavy donors to Governor Joe Lombardo, who is a Republican. And so he's been portrayed in some media as a clean energy giant. And so I think, and he was endorsed by Trump, I think, or excuse me, he endorsed Donald Trump. And so they're, videos of them shaking hands and having a drink together. So I'm just saying there's green energy is going to be embedded in the economy, and Trump's just not going to kill it all. But I'm hoping he takes like this special unreasonable Trump hate against wind turbines and solar panels, and he does. He kills some of these projects. I'll even send him a thank you letter if he kills one around me.
Right.
I mean, we have to deal with all his other stuff, so maybe we can get one good thing out of him, right?
Right. And so it seems like at the federal level, especially with Project 2025, which we didn't mention, but I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah.
That it seems like at the federal level, it's hard to do much because there's some big forces that are in motion there and some big interests, But even with that being the case, do you think that progress can still be made to protect places and to push back on some of these projects at the local level?
That's a good question. I will say about some of the local people I work with, solar energy got them to admit how much they like nature and groundwater and springs and archaeology sites and that sort of thing. And so on a local level, that might be all we have. We state governments may be opposing some of the rollbacks. Like the Trump administration here in Nevada is probably going to come out and try to want to sell a lot of public lands off. And I don't think that's necessarily going to go over well with everybody. They're going to pick places next to a lot of little communities that people actually really love. And so there could be some local pushback against a lot of the things that he does. And then there can also potentially be state designations for parks and that sort of thing. I don't think our governor is really going to go that far, though. I mean, he actually was opposed to the Abiquimme National Monument, um, which is a pretty cool thing that the Biden administration did in the southern tip of Nevada. They made that in a really big national conservation land. And I just don't think that we have a political group in Nevada powerful enough to want to protect things. And so I think the effect out here is going to be bad. Maybe California will be more equipped to oppose a lot of the things that they do. But I think we're going to see a lot of really weird stuff come down in the next couple of years.
Right, right. I guess I brought the topic up to just in part to make the point that, for people who are, rightfully, concerned about the incoming administration, and who do feel strongly that they want to protect places and this and that the best place for them to put their energy is on some local issue or campaign.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of ways you can get involved in that. I just not really sure on a public land level, how good that can be, but it's really good to talk to all the assembly people and the county commissioners and the local politicians, and that could probably trickle up to the administration. I don't know. I'm
Right.
not sure how
Okay,
good that would be, but yeah.
so unfortunately, some of this just is decided at the federal level, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really hard to stop mining, for example, because those like mining law of 1872 it's so dominant that I mean the Bureau of Land Management essentially can never reject a mining proposal through NEPA because of that law. I mean, that's kind of what I'm saying. So that's why I have it on a more negative level. But in terms of protecting a big piece of public land or something, or um, you know, trying to get them to prevent them from selling it for, and disposing of it for private ownership. Yeah, I mean, raising a group of public citizens and lobbying for that thing with local senators and stuff could really, I think, be helpful. Maybe that's the way to do things now. I mean, I do remember in the last Trump administration, a lot of states did mobilize their own laws, the ones that didn't really like him that much. So,
Right, right. Okay. So just to sort of tie things up here, um, could you tell us where people can follow Basin and Range Watch?
we have a updated website called Basin and Range Watch 2. And we're actually having a lot there. We have an X account, but quite honestly, that's going downhill. We're not posting as much on that. It's getting a lot of hateful folks on it. We have the Facebook, social media, Instagram, all that stuff. We Blue Sky. We have a Substack as well. So there are ways to follow us, online. And we put out occasional action alerts. And so we are pretty active on social media and on the internet. So that's one of the better ways to get to follow us.
Okay, yeah, I'll put all those links in the description. Yeah, I saw that you just started a Substack a couple months ago, it looks like.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people like to go on those now. So
Yeah, I've been using Substack, and I'm not on social media anymore, and I do prefer it as a place to put out writing and to have discussions. There's a lot less trolls there.
yeah, it's no, I hear that. There's a lot of them out there. So
Yeah, yeah. I've been on Substack for 2 years. I've only had to block 3 people that entire time.
Well, that's good.
You know,
No, it gets pretty weird. We get people from both sides really like coming after us. It's like it's kind of a hostile environment out there on social media.
right? Because some people think that, oh, because you're opposing this solar thing, oh, you must be in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry or whatever.
Oh yeah, there's a
Or
lot
you're
of
a
that.
climate change denier. Yeah.
Well, we had a guy come on and he was blaming us for the potential death of his children. And we're like, I didn't even respond to that.
Yeah, you can't respond to this.
Yeah, I mean, what do you say to that? Like, but yeah, we have a lot of folks that get on and try to play the blame game. I mean, I've had a couple of people blame me for the Trump victory, and it's like, well, why is that? Because you're opposing this Biden's energy policy so much, and you're making people hate him. I'm just wondering, did we make some people vote for Trump? I don't know. I don't think we're that bad. You know?
It seemed like he had this one in the bag, actually. I don't think you need to be concerned.
Yeah, I know. Some people want to point fingers at everybody and stuff, but that was a funny one, I thought.
Yeah, they definitely do. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Kevin. I really appreciate it. I've we've talked at least 3 or 4 other times, and so I'll be putting links to those conversations too, because these issues just keep going on. And yeah, I just wanted to check in with you about this next administration. And so I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate the work that you and Laura do. And yeah, I hope to come and visit you out there again sometime while you're still there.
Definitely, yeah.
So, mhm.
Yeah, we'd like to see you again, and thank you for giving us the attention and spreading the word around. We really appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'll let you know when this is out so you can send it out to your folks too. So
Okay, well, thank you.
yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is also a blog at colibri.substack.com. That's KOLLIBRI.substack.com. Paid subscribers get exclusive blog posts and early access to podcast episodes. Intro beats by Big Joe Drummer. This outro music by Codebox. Join us again for another episode of Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, the podcast.